Trey Hendrickson, the latest star player to demand a trade. Brian Gutekunst, get on the telephone. Plus, are we talking about the wrong trade chip for the Green Bay Packers?
You are Locked On Packers, your daily Green Bay Packers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Packers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Peter Bukowski, and I cover the Packers for The Leap, a newsletter I would love for you to subscribe to. Follow me on Twitter, Peter_Bukowski. Follow the podcast on Twitter, Locked On Packers. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to the podcast to iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you find podcasts, you will find Locked On Packers, the #1 Packers podcast on the internet, and the show for fans who know what happened, they want to know why, and how. Today's episode brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Trey Hendrickson has been the apple of Packer fans' eyes over the last couple weeks as the reporting around his future in Cincinnati has been clouded. The Bengals signaling publicly that they would like to keep everybody, that they want to keep T. Higgins, they want to keep Jamar Chase, they want to keep Trey Hendrickson, and it seems like, based on the reporting, that they were so far apart contractually. The characterization of the offer was insulting to Trey Hendrickson. That's how you end a relationship with a franchise defender. And this is not Matthew Stafford. This is not, potentially DK Metcalf, where it may just be negotiating tactics. Trey Hendrickson put out a statement thanking people of Cincinnati before he was even traded. So I had a chance to talk to Jake Liscow from Locked On Bengals for Locked On Sports today, and I thought, hey, I bet Packer fans would love to hear how this happened, where this goes, and what the trade compensation could be, just like we did with Corbin yesterday. This is a little shorter, so let's talk to Jake. It's hard to remember a time when this many veteran players have been demanding a trade in one offseason or have been allowed to explore a trade in one offseason. Trey Hendrickson of the Cincinati Bengals, the latest here. Jake Liscow from Locked On Bengals joins me now. And Jake, the Bengals were hinting, were saying, were leaking to reporters, hey, we want to get everyone done. We want to get T. Higgins back and signed. We want to get Trey Hendrickson extended. We're going to deal with Jamar Chase. We've already got Joe Burrow. And now we're here, where it looks like these two sides are parting ways. Why do you think that tune changed?
Well, I don't know what's more surprising, Peter, the fact that the Bengals granted a trade request or the fact that things fell apart. I would lean toward the fact that they actually granted a player permission to explore a trade, which isn't something I can ever remember them doing. Them not getting deals done with their stars. Well, there's plenty of examples of that in recent history. But as you point out, it was a Bengals public message and private message that their plan was, and repeatedly so, to keep all of their stars around and get long-term deals done with them. The plan was to find common ground with Trey Hendrickson and get an extension done. And they didn't manage to do that already. One step of this three-step plan before free agency, or in addition to unrestricted free agency and external free agents and all the smaller free agents that the Bengals have to consider as they're trying to remake their defense, has already failed. And that's a terrible starting place, especially for a fan base that already is out of patience for this ownership group. We called last offseason the most important offseason in Cincinnati Bengals history, with Joe Burrow coming off the wrist injury and a year removed from 2 straight AFC championship appearances, 1 AFC championship win, in another game where they were right there. Could have been 2 straight Super Bowl appearances very easily for the Bengals. Since then, Joe Burrow has agreed to his second contract, and as we've seen with Andy Dalton and Carson Palmer, the Cincinnati Bengals have not figured out how to build a roster around their quarterback on his second deal, even the best of those 3 quarterbacks, and that makes us profoundly disappointing to start this offseason.
This has to be viewed through the lens of the T. Higgins deal as well, because this defense was bad last year. That's like a diplomatic framing of what they were. Lou Anarumo is gone. But now you're also exploring a trade, allowing your best defensive player by a mile to walk out the door, it's hard not to view that through the lens of, hey, maybe you offset that and say, hey, look, Trey Hendrickson, why don't you come back? We'll sign you. And T. Higgins, that same money, why don't you go explore what's out there? Why not handle it that way?
This is my problem with that framing, Peter, is that it was never a resources issue. The Bengals have plenty of resources in cash and cap, as I think we've discussed before, to get all of this done. This is an issue of them being stubborn about their valuation of Trey Hendrickson. And go listen to what Ari Meirov had to say, and he's plugged in with Trey's camp. The offer was described as borderline disrespectful, which is a problem the Bengals have had in the past in various contract negotiations and has repeated itself here. And so it's not really a resources issue. It's not a T or Trey issue. It's we don't think that you're worth as much as you think you're worth. And for the first time when that's happened for a player under contract, he is under contract for 2025. They're allowing him to explore his trade possibilities. So I don't think it's really the issue that you described. It maybe would even be better if it was. That would mean that there were resource constraints and you were forced into making a hard choice. This doesn't feel like that to me. This is the Bengals living up to their reputation. And it's, you can go look at their cash over cap spending and their average spending over time and all these things. And you can say, hey, look, the Bengals spend just barely below average compared to the rest of the NFL. But when it comes to individual player contract negotiations, whether it's Jesse Bates or T. Higgins, the last time these guys tried to talk and get a deal done a year or two ago, that there were 2 rounds of negotiations there, or now Trey Hendrickson, they're not even getting close. And that's happening way too often for their key players for me to answer this question of, if not now, when, any way other than apparently never for this front office.
And that's a pretty tough spot for this team to be in. The only thing, if you're a fan, is hey, let's get some draft capital, try and make this work. Now, the problem, as you pointed out on social media, is they've tried to backfill some of these spots over the last few years, and they've just whiffed on draft picks. That's how you can continue to sustain this. That being said, what do you think is a reasonable offer for Trey Hendrickson at this point in his career? He's 30, will be 31 in December, but has been the most productive pass rusher, not named Myles Garrett or Micah Parsons, in the NFL over the last handful of seasons. So what is that worth to the Bengals, and what is that worth to another team?
Maybe more productive by certain measures. I'm not saying he's a better player than those guys, don't get me wrong, but by certain statistics, you could certainly make an argument. But the Bengals obviously don't value that highly. They're going to turn around and ask other teams then to value that highly and then take on the contract.
We don't think he's worth it, but pay us like he is.
Yeah, the Bengals historically would look at this and say, this is obviously a player that's worth a first-round pick. I don't think anyone is paying a first-round pick for Trey Hendrickson, even at the back of the first round. Even if it's the Washington Commanders, who are rumored to have interest, I don't think that that's anything that's fair to even consider more than a 1% chance of. And I think that might even be too high. I think you look at the historical comparisons, and it's hard to find players with that kind of production for multiple years. And he's coming off of a 35 sacks over 2-season run at his age, with his pedigree being a not first-round pick and a relatively late breakout by NFL standards. It's hard to find a whole lot. And so it's not like Khalil Mack when he got traded to the Bears the first time, right? And there were 2 first-round picks involved there. I don't think you're close to that ballpark. And then I think, well, what about Von Miller with the trade to LA, a second and a third-round pick, and kind of lands somewhere around a second-round pick is what I think you could realistically hope for if you're the Bengals. And then you're talking about trying to remake a defense with Logan Wilson and a bunch of young guys and kind of hoping that you can develop and figure that out.
All right. Thanks to Jake for checking in with that one. Now, when it comes to trading for someone like Trey Hendrickson, we heard DK Metcalf, the Seahawks might want a young receiver. Well, what if there's a different trade chip that we're not talking about that might be even more valuable than one of those young receivers? We'll talk about it next on Locked On Packers. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whether I'm backing my team for a late game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch three, I never feel like I missed my chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. As the discussions around if you want DK Metcalf, is it Romeo Doubs, is it Dontavian Wicks? As that discussion was taking place, I got to thinking, the Packers are going to have to pay Zach Tom, and they're going to pay Zach Tom. Like, that's not a question. There may not be a receiver on the team currently that they are definitely going to extend in the case of Jaden Reed and Dontavian Wicks in a year or so, and in the case of Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson, relatively imminently. It would have to happen in the next 6-8 months, usually. But we'll see. Zach Tom is going to get paid. Well, Deion Dawkins, I mean, he's a left tackle, but it's I would say comparable in terms of quality and those kinds of things. Just got $20 million a year. Are you going to also give Rasheed Walker $20 million a year? Walker Little in Jacksonville just got 14. So Rasheed Walker is a better player and plays a premium position at left tackle. Isn't he worth more than that? So are you going to give Zach Tom the markup on the Deion Dawkins deal? Are you going to go even higher than that? Are you going to go 22, 24 million APY? And he's exactly the kind of player the Packers give real extensions to, not it's a 1-year deal kind of thing. He is a high level starter. But are you going to pay him and Rasheed Walker? And if you're not, if they were receivers, wouldn't you go into the offseason going, well, you got to pay those guys, or you got to make a decision on if you're going to pay those guys? We're having that discussion right now with Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson. Khalil Shakir just got his deal. This is, you usually don't want core pieces going into the last year of their contract without knowing their future. You want them locked up. I would expect at some point this offseason, and they have traditionally done these, it gets done August, September, October. You go back and you look at Elton Jenkins multiple times, Rashawn Gary, offensive lineman, Jordy Nelson, Randall Cobb. Those deals have gotten done late summer, early fall. That's just the way that this tends to work for Green Bay, for whatever reason. If you're not sure on Rasheed Walker, just think about the situation with the Seattle Seahawks. They have not had a quality offensive line, since Walter Jones and Steve Hutchinson? John Schneider has been one of the best general managers in the league over his time, went on an historic run drafting Earl Thomas, Richard Sherman, that whole group. Unbelievable job building that team through the draft. Has not been able to find an offensive lineman to save his life. I understand if they trade DK Metcalf, they've already cut Tyler Lockett. They don't have a starting outside receiver. Don't have one. Not one. Jackson Smith-Njigba is a slot. And if you're Kubiak, that's the offense that they're going to run. You're kind of a 2-receiver team. You need a boundary receiver. But if you want to be a run-heavy, big personnel team, don't you need to beef up that offensive line? And isn't Rasheed Walker exactly the kind of player that you might want? Isn't an offensive tackle a more scarce resource? Same thing with Trey Hendrickson, frankly. You want to trade for Trey Hendrickson? You heard Jake Liscow, 2nd-round pick. Well, what is Rasheed Walker worth on the open market? A starting caliber, quality left tackle. Is that worth, could you do that deal with like a 4th round pick in there? And would you do Rasheed Walker and a 4th for Trey Hendrickson plus the $34 million a year you're going to have to give him on a contract? That's a separate question. But I think Rasheed Walker could be an extremely valuable trade chip if the Packers were so inclined. And I know what you're saying, but Peter, Rasheed Walker is good. The Packers just lost in the playoffs in part because they couldn't block the Eagles. Yes, that's true. They also just drafted in the 1st round a 3-year starter at left tackle in the Pac-12. A guy that Brian Gutekunst and this scouting staff and this coaching staff have said on the record they think can play left tackle. They love Jordan Morgan. Even as Sean Ryan was playing pretty well at right guard, they're trying to find a way to get Jordan Morgan on the field because they think that highly of him. So if you've drafted the potential replacement for that guy and you know you're going to pay Zach Tom, wouldn't it make sense then to see what the value is? What can you get? Whomst could you get? Could he help you land DK Metcalf for a reduced draft pick cost? Could he help you get Trey Hendrickson for a reduced draft pick cost? Or could you just get a 2nd round pick? Would the Kansas City Chiefs give you a 2nd round pick for Rasheed Walker? They don't currently employ a left tackle. Kingsley Suamataia looks like he's going to play guard. Wouldn't the Bengals, part of the whole deal is they can't block and they're leaning in on offense. They're going to have to score 40 points a game. They drafted Amarius Mims, but he's really a right tackle. I'm just saying here. Wouldn't he have value? And if you already have the plan in place, you got it. Now, they have to replace center, but that's the easiest place on the offensive line to replace. And they have Jacob Monk in the building. They could give, Drew Dahlman a call in free agency. This is a good interior offensive line class such that that's really a thing, but there's always interior offensive linemen you can draft on day 3 and get fine play. Like if Sean Ryan and Elton Jenkins are your guards, you're in a pretty good position. This was a top 5 offense last year with Josh Myers at center. And he's an average to below average starting center in the NFL. So if that's the replacement level, and that's not what cost you the game last year or the year before, then why are you that worried about it? Personally, I wouldn't be. I'm not even advocating for this, but I do think, because if you're the Packers, you can pay both. Like they were paying Brian Bulaga starter level money and David Bakhtiari starter level money. And not that I think Zach Tom is David Bakhtiari or that I think Rasheed Walker is Brian Bulaga, but I don't think Zach Tom is that far from David Bakhtiari. I don't think he's that far from being an all-pro. I think he's certainly one of the 3 or 4 best right tackles in the NFL. And Rasheed Walker, Brian Bulaga was like a borderline Pro Bowl kind of player for most of his career. I think Rasheed Walker is in that mix. Like I think he's probably one of the 10 best left tackles in the league, 12 best. There are half the league would love to start Rasheed Walker at left tackle. And if that's true, then he's got to have value. And I'm just saying, if you think Jordan Morgan can do it and do it at a high level, do it at least as well as Rasheed Walker, then I think this team, yes, I understand they want to win now, but if you could use Rasheed Walker as a piece to get another piece that could help you win now, isn't that worth exploring? Now, we've talked about Jeff Hafley and changing your ideology in player acquisition for his defense. Brian Gutekunst doesn't want to do that. He says, in the draft, could it make sense in free agency? We'll talk about it next on Locked On Packers. I thought Brian Gutekunst gave a compelling answer when asked if he was going to fit or alter his philosophy around drafting players to Jeff Hafley. And what he said was, well, look, Jeff Hafley wanted to play a certain style of defense last year, and then in real time, on the fly, had to change it for 2 reasons. Jair Alexander couldn't stay healthy. And Kenny Clark went into a fugue state. I don't know what happened to Kenny Clark last year. And you didn't get, Preston Smith fell off. Rashawn Gary acclimated to the defense slowly over the second half of the year. He was excellent. Lucas Van Ness over the second half of the year came along. Brenton Cox in the second half of the year came along. But he's right. Being didactic in your philosophy is not necessarily good, but adapting too much to a plan, a scheme, is also potentially problematic because these things can change all the time. One player doesn't play to his potential or gets hurt, and you might have to change the way you play defense. And it's actually a good thing for the Packers that Jeff Hafley is the kind of defensive coordinator who can, on the fly, make those changes. There are plenty of coaches out there that would just go, well, this is just what we do. And so we're going to keep doing it. And I think there's potential utility in that too. I love how Aaron Glenn was able to just get his guys, didn't matter who was playing, to just keep going. That's not an easy thing to do. And it's a credit to Glenn that they were able to do that. But and what's more, I've got a lot to say, so I'm trying to compose myself here. What's more, for Brian Gutekunst, the reason they have the models that they have, especially when it comes, because this is really about the defensive front, right? The models that they have are based on not chasing outliers. In general, in the NFL, big, strong, fast is what you want. Now, the game is changing a little bit. Guys like Micah Parsons, you're seeing Abdul Carter, not a huge human. 6'3", 250 is going to probably be the number one overall pick. And if he's not going to fall past 3. Jalen Walker, going to be a top 10 pick. He's like 230 pounds. No, he's not. He's 250. But he's small. He's small. And is going to have to play at 250. So this is a changing NFL to be sure, but you're still chasing outliers, by the way, at the combine. 6'1", 243. That is small. Small. Those guys, by and large, cannot hold up in the NFL. It takes outlier talent to do that. And over the course of league history, teams have been bad at identifying who those outliers are going to be. So I've been on the record with this over and over. I see the utility in the Packers saying, we'd like to stick with big, strong, fast. And everyone is over-indexing Lucas Van Ness, who, by the way, has come along. And I think this year they're expecting big things from him. They're expecting him to be a real impact player. But I look at free agency and I say, the Packers sign people all the time who they wouldn't necessarily have drafted. Josh Jacobs, they would not have drafted. They just would not have drafted. Not athletic enough for them. Xavier McKinney, same thing. Not athletic enough for them. They would not have drafted Xavier McKinney. I don't think they would have drafted Billy Turner, which is funny because one of the reasons why is because Billy Turner, too big probably to play guard, except he played guard for the Packers. So they have been more willing, and we've talked about the reasons why. Once you're an NFL player, we're not projecting anymore. We know what you are. Zadarius Smith, they definitely would not have drafted. Relative athletic score, I think, was under 3. But you watch him and you go, that's a better player than Bud Dupree. They were on the same Kentucky defense. And I remember it's one of my all-time draft hits. I was like, Zadarius Smith is a better NFL prospect than Bud Dupree. I watched them both and I went, Zadarius Smith knows how to win and get off blocks. Bud Dupree has no idea. And I'd rather have that guy. And it's funny because if that draft had happened like 3 years later, I probably would have felt differently. Because I believe in the toolsy part of pass rush. It's been borne out over time. Trey Hendrickson is one of those guys who was just super toolsy and hit. But you look at a Hassan Reddick. I think in free agency it makes sense. Whereas in the draft, the Josiah Stewart, I don't think it makes sense for the Packers to chase that outlier. We know Hassan Reddick is a good NFL player. In the draft, Maxwell Hairston, who I keep calling Malik Hairston. Too small for the Packers. 5, almost 11, 180. It's just too small to bet on. But DJ Reed, same size, proven NFL player. We know he's really, really good. His size doesn't matter. So once the outliers have proven we're outliers in a good way, I think the Packers then have permission. And you look at over time, they have given themselves permission to sign those guys. Now, that's not to say that they wouldn't really like a Chase Young or a Josh Sweat. You know, we got reporting that the Packers are really interested in Iota Yingbo from Indianapolis. 6'6", 280, probably would have tested pretty well. Like, that's the kind of player the Packers probably would have drafted. That happens too. Josh Sweat, definitely the kind of player the Packers would have drafted. It's not to say they wouldn't do that. They've certainly signed guys over the years that they also likely would have drafted. Preston Smith, certainly the kind of player that they probably would have drafted. But it makes sense to say, hey, when it comes to projections, we're not going to chase outliers in the draft. But once you've proven it, that calculation is different. The risk profile is different. And so if they're going to get an undersized corner this offseason, it will not be in the draft. If they're going to get an undersized pass rusher this offseason, a speed rusher, it's probably going to be in free agency, not the draft. And frankly, I think that's the prudent way to approach this. Do I want them? Have I been, everydayers? If you've been an everydayer here for 2-3 years, I have been begging. Lord, I have seen what you have done for others. A speed rusher. Someone who can win quickly. I think in some ways that was what Devontae Wyatt was supposed to be. And we saw it in Georgia. His ability to get off the line of scrimmage and win quickly is excellent. And you still see it. And he's gotten better at it because he's gotten better with his hands. But this is something I think they need. I think Sweat is in play for them. I do think they want to add a pass rusher. Malcolm Kuntz, same kind of deal. Probably would be too small in the draft for them. But I think he's very much in play for them in free agency, which is why I feel comfortable saying if they're going to do these things, it will almost certainly be in free agency, not the draft. All right, the new league year opens next week. Tampering, the free agent period. We're going to get a lot of answers to a lot of questions very soon. So live, if we get big news on our YouTube page, so go subscribe over there. The show will then be in your podcast feed very shortly after that. So I've done, let's see, in 2019, I think we did multiple live shows. It would not be the first time that we've done it. I think we might have done it last year. Is that possible? Could we have done it last year? If you remember and you were there, let me know. I like blackout when it comes to these live shows and that kind of stuff. They all blend together too. So let's have some fun. Let's go have some days. Not just a day. Let's have some days. A string of days. Let's do it. So follow me on all the social medias, Peter_Bukowski, the podcast, as well as out there, Locked On Packers, so you can stay Locked On Packers.